Hey class, welcome back to our history subject and welcome back to our American Revolution book. And today we're diving into chapter 15, A Discouraging Start. So let's review before we get into chapter 15. And again, if you haven't read chapters 1 through 14, please make sure you go back and do that because they all build on top of each other and 15 will not make sense if you haven't read the previous ones. So in chapter 14, we talked about the Great Declaration, which is called the Declaration of Independence. We talked about how first a man named Thomas Paine wrote a pamphlet called Common Sense, which talked about how it made sense, right, for the Americas to separate from Great Britain, right? It made sense because why would someone 3,000 miles away have the right or be able to know how to govern them? It made sense because the Great British Empire wasn't taking care of their rights and protecting them. They were kind of abusing their power to try to control and show them that they had authority. And so that, resonated. That made sense to a lot of people. They understood it. They talked about it, and it started to spread across the colonies that, yes, we should become independent. And then the Second Continental Congress met and they wrote the Declaration of Independence, talking about how Great Britain was abusing their authority, the things that they were doing wrong. It talked about the rights that were endowed by them from their creator, the rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and how the Great Britain wasn't protecting those. And because they weren't, they were going to separate. They were going to become independent from the British Empire. And so now we're diving into our next chapter, 15, Discouraging Start. So maybe, they were happy. The Americans were happy and about what was happening, but kind of sounds like things aren't going to start off very well after they've started this revolution. So during this chapter, we'll be able to compare and contrast, the things that are alike and different between the British and the Continental armies. We'll be able to understand the challenges faced George Washington as the commander of the Continental Army. We'll be able to understand the roles that women and African Americans played in the war effort. And then, as always, be able to understand the core chapter vocabulary words. Please, when you answer the big question discussion post, do not copy and paste an answer. Please use your own words. And then also with your vocabulary words, use the definitions that are found in this book, in this chapter, and don't copy and paste an answer from Google or somewhere else. Okay, so during this chapter, we'll be able to understand and learn how George Washington faced many difficulties when he assumed control of the Continental Army, including facing an enemy that had the size and the strength of the British Army, right? We talked about how last chapter it was reiterated and repeated to us that the British Empire was the world's greatest empire at the time. And so George Washington is facing this massive, powerful army. So now let's call attention to the big question. What challenges did George Washington face when raising an army? Okay, so as we read, let's look for challenges that he faced being the commander of that army. Let's start reading and follow along. Patriot Problems. When you look at some of the problems the Americans faced, you can see that their chances of winning a war against Great Britain were not great. For one thing, the 13 new states may have been united against Great Britain, but their people certainly were not. While some loyalists stayed quiet, others helped the British. Some wrote letters of support for the British cause. Some worked as spies. About 50,000 loyalists actually fought in the war on the side of Great Britain. Remember we talked about loyalists last chapter? Loyalists are those people in the colonies that wanted to keep their ties with Great Britain, whether it was for political, economical reasons. They wanted to actually stay part of the British Empire. So there's people in the colonies that were fighting on the side of Great Britain. So not only does Great Britain have a big army, there's people in the colonies that are joining the army. So many of them moved to Great Britain or Canada after the Revolution. Great Britain had one of the largest armies in the world. In addition to having 50,000 loyalist soldiers, the British hired about 30,000 professional soldiers from other countries. Soldiers for hire are called mercenaries. All right, so read this with me, Cassidy. What is the definition of a mercenary? A soldier from one country paid to fight for another country. Good job. So counting the mercenaries, Great Britain's army was 5 times larger than the Continental Army. The British could also count on their Native American allies in the West. So, as that saying goes, it was like a David versus Goliath fighting. Looking at this picture, looks like one of the redcoats. The British Army had many more trained soldiers than the Continental Army. So the British soldiers were well-trained fighters. Commanders could count on having their soldiers for a certain number of years. They had time to train their soldiers for battle. General Washington had to build an army from scratch. His army was made up mainly of farmers, not professional soldiers. Washington also knew how many soldiers he could count on at any one time. Washington also never knew. So unlike the British Army, where they knew that they had these soldiers for a number of years, these people, these farmers, they got other things to do. Washington isn't sure if he can count on them showing up or not. Some joined the Continental Army for a 3-year term. Most volunteered to serve for less than a year. Some signed up for only 3 months. Others joined the Continental Army when the fighting got near their villages or farms. Then they would leave the army once the British troops moved on. Soldiers would often return to their farms at planting and harvesting time. With all these comings and goings, training an army was nearly impossible. Let's look at this poster. Let's read this caption really quick. Read this with me, Tricero. Posters like this one used to find soldiers for the Continental Army. So these things would be posted around, maybe on trees, storefronts, around town to try to get people to join the Continental Army. Most soldiers in the Continental Army were farmers who volunteered to fight. Hey, you want to come fight? Sure. Let's continue to read. You want to read with me? Let's call on Ella. Ella, let's start reading together. In addition to having a powerful army, Great Britain was one of the wealthiest nations in the world. The British could supply their army with whatever it needed. The Continental Army was often short on cannons, gunpowder, food, and other supplies. It'd be hard to shoot a cannon or a gun if you don't have gunpowder. It'd be hard to give it your best if you're, low on food because you don't have the energy and other supplies. Maybe staying warm at night, maybe they're cold. It didn't even have enough uniforms. So throughout the war, most American soldiers fought in their own clothes. Several times during the war, General Washington wrote to the Continental Congress, if it didn't come up with money for supplies and pay the soldiers soon, the army must absolutely break up. So George Washington is trying to get the Congress, these members of people that have started this, revolution, the independence. He's asking, hey, we got to figure out how to, supply and support these soldiers or we're going to break up. As for a navy, the British had the greatest in the world. They had 100 times as many warships as the Americans had. So none of that looked very good for the Americans. The Americans did have a few things going for them, though. For one, they were fighting for their own land, right? The mission, the vision for independence, that drive, that why, the big factor of fighting and helping them, as we know, succeed. So fresh soldiers and supplies were often available nearby. The British had to ship everything, including soldiers. So that's one benefit, right, that the Americans had. Whatever they were getting, it was within those colonies, but the British had to ship it 3,000 miles away across the sea, including their soldiers, for them to get it. The Americans were also fighting to defend their homes, families, and freedoms, right? Those rights that, all men have. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They were fighting for that. Again, their vision for a greater country, a greater world. Many soldiers on the British side were just fighting for money. That made a difference. The size of the country was another advantage for the American side. If the British won in part of the country, American armies could move to another. Thomas Paine wrote that the American plan would be like a game of checkers. "We can move out of one square to let you come in," he said to the British, "in order that we may afterwards take 2 or 3 for one." Since the Americans could keep moving around, he said, "we can always prevent a total defeat." All right, so now let's talk about another one of our core or our focus objectives, the support from women and African Americans in the war. So the British could count on its professional soldiers, mercenaries, and loyalists, including African Americans. In fact, most African Americans at this time supported the British cause. The British actively sought help from the African American community. They promised freedom to any enslaved person who fought for the king. Now that would be a big motivator, right? Most African Americans who came over were enslaved, and so the British is saying, hey, if you fight for us, we'll give you freedom. The Patriots had their own sources of help. The Patriot side also had support from African Americans. It had important support from women too. Women played many roles in the American Revolution. Working in army camps, they washed, cooked, sewed, made gunpowder, and nursed the wounded. So all those supplies that the American armies needed, the women provided that stuff. Without them, they would have not had what they needed, not been in the shape that they were to, as we know, be in a position to win the war and to get this independence. They played a huge part. So sometimes women went into battle, even though they weren't supposed to. In one battle, Mary Ludwig Hayes brought her husband's cannon crew water from a nearby stream. Pitcher carriers brought water to cool off the cannons, which would overheat in battle. She carried so many pitchers that they called her Molly Pitcher. According to legend, Molly's husband became ill during the battle. The other members of his cannon crew had been killed. Molly loaded and fired the cannon by herself until other soldiers arrived to take over. Now that's awesome. Another woman who helped the Patriot cause was Deborah Sampson. Sampson dressed in men's clothing and joined the army. She was a talented soldier. It was only when she was wounded that the doctors found out she was a woman. A number of other women served as messengers and spies. Of course, women didn't have to be on the battlefield to help the Patriot cause. One of the greatest contributions was at home. In addition to doing their useful work, they also did the work of the men who had gone off to fight. There were many women who kept the family farm going or the family business running. So as we have learned, in addition to women, African Americans also played a role in the American Revolution. About 5,000 African Americans fought on the American side of the Revolutionary War. Most of them were free men from the northern states. They took part in nearly every battle, starting with the very first at Bunker Hill. Several African American regiments came from New England states. So regiment, let's read that together, Leo. A regiment is a unit in the army. So there were units of African Americans who mostly came from the New England states. Okay, so let's go back up to our big question. So what challenges did George Washington face when raising an army? Okay, so when you think about the British Army, were they trained or untrained soldiers? And then what was the American Army, right? Where did most of those members of the American Army, the Continental Army, come from? And then he was never sure how many he could count on because they had other responsibilities, right? And then they also lacked what? What also did they lack, the Continental Army, compared to the well-funded and supported British Army? So those are some hints and some points that you should be hitting on in your answer for the big question. And that is it for chapter 15. I will see you guys in the next lesson.